The first assault came on June 13th, driven more by enthusiasm than strategy. Without siege engines, without ladders tall enough to reach the battlements, the Crusaders tried to take the city by faith alone. They were slaughtered. Boiling oil, Greek fire, and storms of arrows met every attempt to scale the walls. Among those watching was Tancred, Bohemon's nephew, who had carved out a domain around the Sea of Galilee. He later told a chronicler, "We attacked like madmen, believing God would grant us victory, as he had at Antioch. But God teaches harsh lessons. Faith without preparation is presumption." The failure shocked them into practicality. They needed wood for siege engines, but the area around Jerusalem was nearly treeless. Then, as if by providence, Genoese ships arrived at Jaffa, carrying supplies and, more importantly, skilled engineers. The Crusaders dismantled the ships and hauled the timber 40 miles to Jerusalem. For 3 weeks they laboured in the scorching heat of a Judean summer. 2 massive siege towers rose, along with catapults and battering rams. The work was torment. The sun beat down mercilessly. Water was scarce and had to be carried from distant springs under constant threat of Muslim raids. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. The Muslim defenders watched these preparations with growing alarm. They reinforced the sections of wall where the towers would strike. They prepared their own engines. Most disturbing to the Crusaders, they would parade holy crosses on the walls and defile them, knowing the psychological impact on their enemies. Then came another vision, or perhaps a moment of strategic genius disguised as divine inspiration. A hermit claimed that God had spoken to him. The Crusaders must purify themselves through penance, then march barefoot around Jerusalem as Joshua had circled Jericho. On the 7th day, the walls would fall. On July 8th, the entire Crusader army, from the greatest prince to the lowliest pilgrim, removed their shoes and walked in procession around the city. The Muslims jeered from the walls, but the Crusaders marched in silence, priests at their head carrying relics and crosses. They climbed the Mount of Olives, where Christ had ascended to heaven, and there Peter the hermit preached with all his old fire. The ritual served its purpose. It unified the army, reminding them why they had come. It also convinced the defenders that these Franks were religious fanatics who would never give up. Some of the garrison's mercenaries began to slip away, sensing inevitable defeat. The final assault began on the night of July 13th. The 2 great siege towers, one commanded by Godfrey of Bouillon, the other by Raymond of Toulouse, rolled toward different sections of the wall. The fighting was apocalyptic. Greek fire turned men into human torches. Stones from catapults crushed attackers and defenders alike. The air filled with smoke, screams, and the stench of burning flesh. For 2 days the battle raged. Raymond's tower became stuck, unable to breach the southern walls. But Godfrey, fighting at the northern wall near Herod's Gate, managed to bridge the gap. As July 15th dawned, Godfrey himself stood on the walls of Jerusalem, his banner planted where none thought it could be. The defence crumbled with shocking speed. As Crusaders poured over the walls, the garrison fled to the Temple Mount, Islam's 3rd holiest site after Mecca and Medina. Others took refuge in the Tower of David, where Iftikhar ad-Dawla made his last stand. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Crusades. The Crusaders, driven by 3 years of suffering and religious hatred, unleashed a massacre that shocked even medieval sensibilities. Muslims were cut down wherever they were found. Those who fled to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, hoping for sanctuary, were slaughtered until, as Raymond of Aguilera wrote with disturbing pride, men rode in blood up to their knees in bridle reins. The Jewish population, who had taken no part in the fighting, fled to their synagogues. The Crusaders set the buildings ablaze, singing Christian hymns as the people inside burned alive. The massacre continued for 3 days. Contemporary Muslim sources claimed 70,000 were killed. though modern historians suggest the number was closer to 3,000, still a horrific toll. Even some Crusaders were disturbed by the slaughter. Tancred had given his protection to a group of Muslims on the Temple Mount, but other Crusaders killed them anyway, staining his honour. The Provençal chronicler Raymond of Aguilé, despite his earlier bloodthirsty accounts, admitted it was impossible to look upon the vast numbers of slain without horror. Everywhere lay fragments of human bodies, and the very ground was covered with the blood of the slain. Only Iftikhar ad-Dawla and his personal guard were spared, ransomed for a massive sum. As he left Jerusalem, he reportedly told Raymond of Toulouse, "You have won this round, but this is not the end. Islam has a long memory." On July 22nd, the Crusaders held a solemn procession to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. These same men, who had waded through blood, now walked barefoot as penitents, weeping with joy as they prayed at Christ's tomb. The contradiction seemed lost on them. In their minds, they had liberated the holy city from infidel pollution. The massacre was God's judgment on his enemies. The question of who should rule Jerusalem sparked immediate controversy. Raymond of Toulouse, the wealthiest and most experienced prince, seemed the obvious choice, but when offered a crown, he reportedly said, "I will not wear a crown of gold where Christ wore a crown of thorns." Whether this was genuine piety or political calculation, knowing others would oppose him, the refusal opened the door for Godfrey of Bouillon. On July 22nd, Godfrey was elected ruler, though he refused the title of king, calling himself instead Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Most of the Crusaders, their vow fulfilled, prepared to return home. They had prayed at the Holy Sepulchre, bathed in the Jordan River, taken palm fronds from Jericho. The pilgrimage was complete. Of the hundreds of thousands who had taken the cross, perhaps only 2,000 knights and twice that many infantry remained to defend the new kingdom. But the Muslim world was already stirring. The loss of Jerusalem sent shockwaves from Baghdad to Cairo. The poet Al-Abiwadi captured the Muslim anguish. The unbelievers have conquered Jerusalem. Where are the swords of Islam? Where is the faith of those who claim to serve Allah? We have become a joke to our enemies. The Crusaders had won their great prize, but holding it would prove far harder than taking it. They controlled a few coastal cities and a narrow corridor to Jerusalem, surrounded by a sea of hostile powers. Their kingdom was a dagger thrust into the heart of Islam, and Islam would not forget. As Godfrey of Bouillon stood in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that first Christmas of Frankish rule, he might have reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him there. From Pope Urban's speech at Clermont to this moment was only 4 years, but they had been years that changed the world. The First Crusade was over. The age of the Crusader states had begun, and with it, nearly 2 centuries of war, coexistence, cultural exchange, and bitter conflict that would transform both East and West forever. Jerusalem was Christian again, but at what cost and for how long? In the year 1100, barely 6 months after the conquest of Jerusalem, Godfrey of Bouillon lay dying. The man who had refused a crown of gold had ruled for less than a year, and already the kingdom of Jerusalem faced extinction. Muslim armies probed its borders. The few thousand Franks who remained were outnumbered 100 to 1. It seemed the great crusade might end with a whimper, its conquests swept away like sandcastles before the tide. But something extraordinary happened. Against all odds, against all logic, the Crusader states not only survived, but thrived. For nearly 2 centuries, a Frankish society would flourish in the Levant, creating a unique civilization that was neither wholly Western nor Eastern, but something new under the sun. They called it Outre-mer, the land beyond the sea. 4 major states emerged from the chaos of conquest: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, and the counties of Edessa and Tripoli. Each was ruled by Frankish nobles, but their subjects were overwhelmingly Muslim and Eastern Christian. It was an impossible arrangement that somehow worked. Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's brother, rushed from Edessa to claim the throne of Jerusalem. Unlike Godfrey, he had no qualms about wearing a crown. On Christmas Day, 1100, he was crowned King Baldwin I in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, establishing a dynasty that would endure for nearly a century. Baldwin was everything a Crusader king needed to be: warrior, diplomat, and pragmatist. He understood that the Franks could not rule through force alone. They were too few, their enemies too many. Survival required adaptation, compromise, and above all, the creation of a functioning state. The transformation was remarkable. Frankish nobles who had left Europe as religious warriors became Oriental potentates. They learned Arabic, employed Muslim physicians, and relaxed in steam baths. Their wives wore silk and pearls, shocking new pilgrims with their adoption of Eastern fashions. Some even used makeup and perfume, scandalizing churchmen who saw moral decay in every comfort. Fulcher of Chartres, who had marched with the First Crusade and settled in Jerusalem, wrote with wonder, "We who are Occidentals have now become Orientals. He who was a Roman or a Frank has in this land been made into a Galilean or a Palestinian. We have already forgotten the places of our birth." The key to Outremer's survival was its policy of accommodation. Unlike the massacre that marked Jerusalem's conquest, the Crusader states generally allowed religious freedom to their Muslim and Jewish subjects. They paid higher taxes than Christians, but could practice their faith, maintain their own courts for religious matters, and even serve in the military. This pragmatism shocked new arrivals from Europe. Usama ibn Munkid, a Muslim nobleman who had many Frankish friends, recorded an illuminating incident. He was praying in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Templars had converted to their headquarters but still allowed Muslim prayer, when a newly arrived Frank attacked him for not facing east. The Templars immediately intervened, apologizing and explaining that this Frank was fresh from Europe and didn't understand local customs. Trade flourished in this unlikely kingdom. Italian merchants established quarters in every coastal city. Acre became one of the great ports of the Mediterranean, where eastern spices met western silver. Sugar plantations, a new crop for Europeans, enriched noble families. The gold basint of Jerusalem became a trusted currency from London to Cairo, but this prosperity rested on military might, and here the Crusader states developed something revolutionary: the military orders. The Knights Templar, founded around 1119 to protect pilgrims, evolved into a standing army of warrior monks. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but their corporate wealth was immense. Their castles dotted the landscape like stone sentinels. The Hospitallers followed a similar path, transforming from a charitable order caring for sick pilgrims into a military force. These orders solved a critical problem. They provided permanent garrisons in a land where most knights returned to Europe after their pilgrimage. A Templar or Hospitaller would spend decades in Outremer, becoming expert in local warfare and politics. Their castles were marvels of military architecture. Crac des Chevaliers, the Hospitaller fortress in Syria, could house 2,000 men and withstand years of siege. These weren't just fortifications, but centres of administration, controlling vast agricultural estates worked by Muslim peasants under Frankish oversight. The nobility of Outremer developed its own character, distinct from European feudalism. The High Court of Jerusalem, where the king was theoretically just first among equals, became famous for its legal sophistication. The Assizes of Jerusalem, their law code, balanced Frankish custom with local necessity. Women in Outremer enjoyed freedoms unknown in Europe. They could inherit fiefs, rule in their own right, and choose their husbands after widowhood. Queen Melisenda, who ruled Jerusalem from 1131 to 1153, was one of the most powerful monarchs of her age.